Good morning. I'm going to give you a little sample of my book, Her Unexpected Roommate. You ready? Chapter 1. Miss Winters. Ginny forced her eyes away from the spring-filled sight outside. The bright light that radiated in nature was in sharp contrast to the darkness and despair sitting inside her chest at the moment. Yes? Are you ready to hear the will? Mr. Filcourt asked kindly. His nose twitched, causing his full mustache to shift like a squirming caterpillar. A small part of Jenny wanted to chuckle at the image, but laughing hadn't been a part of her life for a long time, and it held even less of a place now. Go ahead, but I already know what it says. She clasped her cold hands together. Mr. Filcourt cleared his throat. I'm sure you do, he agreed with a heavy nod. Maggie, Miss Winters, planned for this a long time ago. Jenny nodded and let her mind wander again. Other than the lawyer, she was the sole person in the room. Because I'm the only one left. Her mother had died when Jenny was a little girl, leaving her in the hands of her widowed grandmother. Her mother had no siblings, and no one knew Jenny's father to be able to contact any other family. It had always been assumed that he was a passing tourist. A simple one-night stand. Jenny grimaced and shifted in her seat. Nothing gave a girl confidence like knowing she was an accident. Most would say that Jenny's upbringing had been difficult. Grandma Maggie wasn't exactly known for being warm. While not cruel, Margaret Winters was not the cookie-baking, bun-wearing, cheek-squishing grandma in the fairy tales. No, Margaret Winters had known loss. Too much of it, causing her to go through life with a stoic expression and a get-it-done attitude. With that as her example, it was no wonder that Ginny had given up her teenage years and any chance at college in order to care for Margaret, as she slowly withered away from lymphatic cancer. Life was hard, but Winters women had learned to be survivors. Ginny tucked a dark chunk of hair behind her ear, an assumed gift from her non-existent father, since her mother had been blonde, and tried to force the memories from her mind. I give all I have, my worldly possessions and half ownership in the Boardwalk Manor, to my granddaughter and sole living relative, Genevieve Winters, Mr. Filcourt said in a monotone voice. Ginny stiffened. Excuse me? Mr. Filcourt stopped and twitched his mustache. I beg your pardon. Would you read that last part again? Ginny's heart began to pound. Surely she had heard wrong. Or maybe the lawyer's mustache was interfering with his reading, because that last sentence couldn't have been correct. Mr. Filcourt cleared his throat again and studied the paper, tilting his head back so he could better see through his bifocals. I give all I have, my worldly... The next part, Ginny urged. A single bead of sweat ran down her spine, distracting her slightly. She sat back in her seat, pressing her shirt against her skin, hoping her blouse would soak it up so she could focus. She would worry about the dry cleaning bill later. Mr. Filcourt glared at her above his glasses. I was getting to that. She forced herself to nod, but not speak again. Ginny's clasped hands became clammy, and her foot wanted to tap impatiently, but she wrangled her body into submission. My worldly possessions and half ownership in the Boardwalk Mansion to my granddaughter, and I think there's been a mistake, Ginny interrupted. Mr. Filcourt humphed, his mustache wiggling, before straightening in his seat. What do you mean? Ginny took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. You said half ownership. That can't be right. Eyebrows almost as large as the mustache rose high on a wrinkled forehead. It is. How can that be? Ginny leaned forward. My grandmother owned that house. She owned it before I was born, and I grew up there. She always told me everything would belong to me. Who else would she leave anything to? I'm the only family she had. Mr. Filcourt sighed and took off his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, Miss Winters, but there's nothing incorrect in the will. He looked up, his dark eyes slightly sunken in his old age, but still as sharp as a man half his age. Many years ago, when you were just a tiny thing, Maggie, Mrs. Winters, was struggling to pay her taxes. She reached out to an old friend who paid off the amount in exchange for half ownership of the home. He wiggled his nose. I don't have to tell you that your home is right on the beach. It's prime property. He chuckled darkly. It was a shrewd move on Mr. James' part. Mr. James? Ginny could hardly breathe. Every dream she held onto for the past 10 years was slowly going up in smoke. All the sacrifices, the time, money, and jobs, the lack of a social life, and the loss of companionship in her life had been worth it as long as Ginny could one day open her bed and breakfast. It was a dream she'd had since she was a young teenage girl, and now it was all for naught. There was no way that she could renovate the mansion and open a business if she only owned half the home. The air felt heavy and thick as yet another blow was dealt to the last remaining Winters woman. When will I get a break? Am I just as doomed as Grandma to live from one tragedy to another? Mr. Philcore nodded. Yes, and Mr. Verl, James. He was friends with your grandfather back in the day. Mr. Philcore's eyes became unfocused as he recalled his memories. He hasn't been back here since the day he paid off the taxes, Mr. Philcore mused. Dark eyes met Ginny's once more. In fact, at his age, he'd probably be just as happy to sell you his half. He hasn't made any move to use his ownership in any way. A small beam of hope began to ease the weight on Ginny's shoulders. Do you really think so? Mr. Philcore nodded. I don't see why not. If he wanted any say in the building, he's waited an awfully long time to do anything about it. He cleared his throat and shuffled the papers. I'm sure we can look up his information and send him an email or a phone call. Mr. Philcore raised his eyebrows. Would you like my office to check into it? He smiled softly. In memory of Maggie. Ginny relaxed, grateful for loyalty that seemed so common among the older generation. I would really appreciate that, Mr. Philcore. Thank you. I've waited this long. I can wait a few more days. Her Unexpected Roommate. Find it on all retailers.